Okay, so can you hear me? Okay, great. So this little hiccup is part and parcel to my very strange week. So please bear with me. If it looks like I'm reading from my notes, it's because I am. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Can everybody see? Well, I'm assuming everyone can see my slides. So I'm just going to get started, okay? So I'd like to welcome you to Are Vampires Still Scary? How Vampires Have Evolved in Popular Fiction. I have been obsessed with vampires since I was probably in middle school after I read Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. And since then, I have consumed a lot of vampire fiction. I've written some nonfiction about vampires, including my blog series, With This Ring, You'll Be Dead, The Acceptance of Violence Against Female Protagonists in Romantic Vampire Fiction. Vampires also tend to show up in my own fiction, including my Stoker-nominated novel, Invisible Chains, which is a fictional slave narrative told from the POV of a young female slave. So in my consumption of vampire fiction, I've noticed some trends and tropes. And as I've watched how vampires have changed over time, I start to wonder, do people still think that they're scary? So before we dive into talking about whether vampires are scary or not, I think we should define what a vampire is. So let's start with the basics. A vampire is a spectral being in a human body who maintains semblance of life by leaving the grave at night to suck the blood of the living as they sleep. But this, that qualifies as scary, right? But I don't think this definition really gives us a sense of what they look like. In most accounts taken from European folklore, they simply look like the recently deceased, with only minor signs of decay. Some are described as having a rosy blush to their cheeks from all of the blood that they've gorged themselves on. But we don't really get a sense of their personality or their motivation beyond needing to drink blood. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to focus primarily on European folklore, a few Gothic horror standards, the many faces of Dracula, and contemporary representations of vampires in romantic vampire fiction, because personally, I think they are most scary when they are in love. Okay, so what makes vampires scary? At the most basic level, what makes a vampire scary is the fact that they are undead and they prey upon the living. They live on human blood, are difficult to kill, they are faster and stronger than humans, they can mesmerize people or sometimes even read our minds. Some vampires can shapeshift, like Dracula, who can turn into a bat or a wolf or even become mist. And some vampires are so devoid of humanity that they enjoy hunting humans for sport, not just sustenance. So in 2007, the 30 Days of Night horror comics created by Steve Niles and Ben Templesmith were adapted to a film that reminded us as an audience that it might not be a good idea to take a vampire to prom. These vampires cut off all communication to a small isolated town in Alaska, and the town of Barrow is so far north that it remains in darkness for almost 2 months out of the year. That's the actual town of Barrow. In the fictionalized account, they remain in darkness for 30 days, which is perfect for vampires to descend on the town and prey on the people during this time of complete darkness. Humans are food and entertain them, but have no other value. So, why should we care if vampires are still scary? Well, they're a staple of popular fiction with the origins in Gothic horror, like Dracula and Carmilla, and also the penny dreadfuls like Barney the Vampire. These stories were inspired by the nightmarish myths and legends of Eastern Europe, but each writer used vampires as a vehicle for exploring social, political, sexual, and racial issues while frightening and titillating their readers. Over time, they have been adapted to fit a variety narratives. I'm going to talk about the roles of vampires in popular fiction and also how their appearances and tropes have changed over time, and hopefully convince you that vampires are still scary, even if they sparkle. So I want to share with you that recently a friend of mine used the blog series that I wrote in one of her horror fiction classes, and she was surprised to find out that many of the young women in the class had never thought of vampires as being monsters. They only viewed them as romantic heroes. So before we start talking about fictional vampires, we should probably look at what inspired Gothic horror. Two of the most famous figures in vampire lore come to us from Eastern Europe: Vlad Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler, of Wallachia, Romania, and Countess Elizabeth Báthory, also known as the Blood Countess of Hungary. On the left of the screen is a German woodcut from 1499 depicting one of the legendary stories about Vlad, in which he would occasionally dine and entertain guests while surrounded by the impaled bodies of his enemies. And on the right, we have a depiction of an Iron Maiden, which was supposedly used by Countess Báthory to not only torture, but also drain the bodies of girls and women so that she could bathe in their blood. Keep in mind that Vlad and Elizabeth pissed off a lot of people while they were alive, and so many of the stories told and retold about them were likely exaggerated after their deaths in order to defame them. But either way, they provided us with great fodder for stories. So, this handsome devil here ruled Wallachia 3 times between 1448 and his death. He's often considered one of the most important rulers of Wallachian history and is also considered a national hero in Romania. While he didn't invent impalement, he probably used it more effectively than anyone else in history to strike fear into his enemies, which worked as a great tactic to keep them from invading Wallachia. He had so many people impaled at one time that visitors to his castle mistook the impaled bodies for a forest until they heard the wails of agony as they got closer. The life of Vlad Tepes inspired Bram Stoker, who used not only the name of Dracula, but also Transylvania, where Vlad was born. Okay, so Elizabeth Báthory earned the title Blood Countess because of the stories of her bathing in the blood of girls and women, preferably virgins. She believed that by doing so, she would extend her life and also keep herself looking beautiful longer. So here's a fun fact. Elizabeth Báthory is in the Guinness Book of World Records as being the most prolific female murderer of all time, with an impressive kill count of over 600. So, why did she torture, bleed, and murder so many people? The short answer is that she was bored. She was married to a Hungarian nobleman at 11 and remained married to him for 29 years. His courtly responsibilities kept him away from home most of the time, so while her husband was away, she perfected the art of serial killing. Her life is also thought to have inspired parts of Stoker's work and many other books and films that range from the absurd to the spectacularly wonderful and horrific. So now that we know where some inspiration for vampire fiction comes from, let's talk about the fiction. So penny dreadfuls were a popular and cheap form of entertainment in Victorian England. And these serialized comics or booklets could be bought weekly and usually depicted subjects of a violent nature. Gothic fiction or Gothic horror deals with horror, death, and often romance. These themes combined to create atmospheric and thought-provoking stories that examined the cultural issues of the Victorian era. British Victorians had many restrictions placed upon their behavior: class structure, racial barriers, and lots of rules about social and sexual conduct. So essentially, repression was the national pastime. And these forms of literature were an outlet for people who were expected to be on their best behavior, regardless of their social standing, during one of the most violent times in history, due to, among other things, the expansion of empire and the transatlantic slave trade. Before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula, other vampires entertained Victorian readers, including Lord Ruthven, who appears in The Vampire by John Polidori. As I mentioned, prior to Gothic fiction, vampires only appeared in folklore and were sometimes blamed for outbreaks of illness and were depicted as horrific undead monsters who preyed on the living. Victorian vampires are very different in that they appear to be regular people living among humans, and this change probably began with the publication of Polidori's short story. His vampire, Lord Ruthven, is described as a suave British nobleman. Polidori wrote the story as part of the famous writing competition between Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, and Mary Shelley, in which the idea for Frankenstein was spawned. So modern vampires tend to be more like Lord Ruthven in that they are handsome, wealthy, charming, manipulative, and are able to masquerade as human, but without any outward signs of aging. Barney the Vampire was one of the most popular penny dreadfuls, and it's attributed to two writers, James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Peckett Press. This vampire tale features Sir Francis Varney, who embodies many of the behaviors we now recognize as common tropes in vampire fiction. It was the first story to introduce sharpened teeth with the following line: "With a plunge, he seizes her neck in his fang-like teeth." Aside from having fangs, other tropes include blood drinking, sexualized violence against female victims, deep regret and emotional turmoil since Varney hates his condition and ultimately attempts to commit suicide, but not before writing down his origin story for a sympathetic priest. Perhaps we can look at Varney as a precursor to Interview with a Vampire, in that you have a vampire who feels trapped in his life and wishes to share his experience with someone who is willing to listen. Also, vampirism is portrayed as a curse, so that readers are essentially meant to feel sympathy for Varney and view him as a victim. So Sheridan Le Fanu was an Irish writer who gave us not only a female vampire, but a female vampire who prefers the companionship of women. This Gothic horror tale is told from the POV of Laura, one of Carmilla's female victims. And Carmilla is attracted to the young woman and expresses romantic desires towards her. Oddly enough, homosexuality is not viewed as a negative force in the story. So being a lesbian is not one of Carmilla's vampiric abilities used to inspire fear in the reader. It's kind of left sort of ambiguous, and it's up to the reader to decide what's going on in the story. So as the story goes along, it turns out that Carmilla is an ancestor of Laura's, which she discovers when she finds a painting of Carmilla dating back to 1698. Much like the missing and murdered girls in the real-life tale of Countess Bathory, Carmilla kills young women and girls in nearby towns. So once Carmilla's origin story comes to light and she's revealed as a vampire, a stake is driven through her heart, she's decapitated, the head and body are burned to ashes, which are then thrown in a river. So while this might seem like overkill, these practices can be traced back to funerary rites in Eastern Europe, Germany, and other parts of Europe, and even America, where vampirism was suspected. So I'm sure that most of you, if you've never read Dracula, first of all, shame on you. You should do it immediately after this presentation. But Dracula is easily one of the most recognized Gothic horror novels of all time and has been adapted to film, stage, television, radio, RPGs, video games, and even anime. Count Dracula is one of the most famous vampires in fiction, and his appearance on stage and film has evolved over time as various actors take on the role. Dracula is an almost perfect example of Gothic fiction due to the fact that it blurs the boundaries between sexual orientation, race, class, and even species. The Count is attracted to both Jonathan Harker and Mina Murray. His appearance is both Eastern and Western, and he's an ancient nobleman who can mingle easily with vagrants. Stoker's vampire embodies many of Victorian England's anxieties about disease, sexually transmitted or otherwise, racial mixing, the fear of overt female sexuality, and foreign invasion. Dracula can shapeshift, turn into mist, use mesmerism, scale walls like an insect, change his appearance from old to young, control animals, and he can even walk in daylight. Since Dracula is the most recognizable vampire fiction that most people are familiar with, I'm going to focus on how his character has evolved and therefore had an influence on popular culture in general, and specifically vampire fiction since 1897 to the present. Full disclosure, when I was putting this together, I agonized over what I was going to include, what I was not going to include, and I think I probably put these slides together about 4 or 5 times before I settled on the fact that there was only so much time to talk about the vast amount of information about vampires. So initially, like I said, there were some other vampires I wanted to include, and initially I was going to talk about Max Schreck's Count Orlok from the 1922 film Nosferatu, mainly because F.W. Murnau based his film on Stoker's Dracula. However, Stoker's widow refused to give Murnau the rights to the story, and so Murnau had to change his script. But essentially, Nosferatu has all the basic story elements of Dracula. So since we're not going to start there, we're going to start with Bela Lugosi in the 1931 Universal film Dracula. So Lugosi popularized the character on stage before he appeared on screen, and he developed the costume that would become synonymous with Dracula for decades. Shrek's vampire is terrifying like the monsters of folklore, but Lugosi gave us an attractive vampire that looked more like the vampires of Gothic horror. Lugosi was the first silver screen monster to be viewed as a sex symbol with a large following of female fans. Hammer Film Productions introduced audiences to Christopher Lee's Dracula in 1958. The full-color film gave us fangs, red-eyed vampires, and lots of blood. Blood that was usually flowing over exposed cleavage or down Dracula's chin. Lee's Dracula is both frightening and sexy, linking the imagery of blood and violence with sexual release on screen. Therefore, in a sense, making violence against women seem sexy. Lee starred in 8 Hammer horror films between 1958 and 1973 and became the gold standard for vampires for more than a decade, but he still wore Lugosi's cape. In the American blaxploitation classic Blacula, William Marshall's character is victimized by Count Dracula. After refusing to help the African prince end the transatlantic slave trade and threatening to enslave the prince's wife, Dracula turns the prince into a vampire, seals him into a coffin, and then imprisons his wife in the same crypt where she starves to death. So even if we can't agree whether this Dracula is scary or not, we can definitely all agree that the Dracula in this movie is an asshole. The film explores race, sexuality, class strife, and cultural differences within the African diaspora. It was highly popular with Black audiences and was one of the highest grossing movies that year. And yes, William Marshall still wore the cape. In the 1979 adaptation starring Frank Langella, the creators pulled from Stoker's novel and the 1924 stage play, but Langella is still taking cues from Lugosi and wears the cape. The plot differs from the novel in several ways, including being marketed with the tagline, "A love story." While this was meant to make the film more romantic, it won the 1979 Saturn Award for Best Horror Film. I probably watched this film at least 20 times on cable when I was going through puberty, and Frank Langella quickly became my favorite Dracula. He took the idea of sexy vampires to a whole new level and turned Dracula into a romantic leading man. So, regardless of how ridiculous Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula can be at times, Gary Oldman's Dracula is kind of spectacular. Not only does the movie follow the novel more closely, it also dips back into the life of Vlad Tepes, making a connection between history and fiction on screen. It's a great horror movie, and it's also a great love story. The scene in Bram Stoker's Dracula where Dracula slices open his chest for Mina to drink his blood, harkens back to a similar scene in Langella's Dracula, again reminding us of the link between sex and death and sharing of blood and other bodily fluids in vampire fiction. Oldman's Dracula had a lot of costumes, but not a single cape among them. So, Dracula Untold. This beautifully violent and sometimes scary dark fantasy movie relies more on the fictionalized accounts of Vlad Dracula's life rather than Stoker's novel. The two merge to give us a powerful medieval warlord who accepts the curse of vampirism and uses it to his advantage on the battlefield. The use of medieval history makes this film, set in the 15th century, an enjoyable period piece about a heroic monster. Luke Evans is obviously easy on the eyes, and despite all the violence and his love of killing, he still somehow manages to be sexy. Not a black cape in sight. So, we just talked about multiple versions of Dracula showing the evolution of vampires in fiction. Dracula's narrative was adapted over time to meet the needs and expectations of changing audiences. And clearly, in many of these films, sex and violence are linked when a vampire engages in a romantic relationship. In each case, the vampire turns or attempts to turn his female victim or love interest into a vampire, either with or without consent. The violence that is inherent in vampire sexuality make murder seem sexy in these narratives, creating a very troubling trope in romantic vampire fiction. The trope I'm referring to is the acceptance of violence against female protagonists in romantic vampire fiction. This trend is really a collection of tropes that I'll break down to show how this trope is problematic. I'm going to focus primarily on two very popular series of novels, Stephenie Meyer's Twilight saga and Deborah Harkness's All Souls trilogy. And I'm also going to talk about The Vampire Diaries, which is the very popular TV show based on a series of YA novels by L.J. Smith. So why these specific narratives? Well, first of all, they're extremely popular with a wide and diverse audience. And second, because those audiences are predominantly made up of girls and women between the ages of roughly 11 to 40. I would argue older, but for the purposes of this, we're gonna have that range between 11 to 40. So why does this matter? Why should we care about this trope? Well, because these narratives depict sexual relationships between vampires and humans, and the vampires are the romantic male leads or heroes. Remember when I mentioned the female students who never thought of vampires as monsters? Well, there is a reason for that. So I mentioned that the shift to the modern idea of vampires in fiction probably began as far back as 1819 with the publication of John Polidori's The Vampire, and the introduction of a suave British vampire aristocrat, Lord Ruthven. We also looked at how sexuality entered the vampire narratives of Gothic horror with the first reference to a vampire plunging his fangs into a woman's neck in Barney the Vampire. And if that isn't a metaphor for sex, I'm not sure what is. But the first reference to lesbian vampires in Carmilla, and also bisexuality in Dracula. Contemporary vampires are similar to these early romantic monsters. If you have read any vampire fiction in the last 20 to 30 years, you're familiar with how sexualized these monsters have become. While we can still debate if they are scary or not, we can definitely agree that they are sexier. Some notable series with smoking hot vampires include Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series, Janine Frost's Night Huntress series, Joey Hill's Vampire Queen series, and of course, Charlaine Harris's Southern Vampire Mysteries. So we can agree that vampires are sexy, and in my opinion, that makes them more dangerous than the vampires of Gothic horror. These skilled supernatural lovers occupy some of our darkest thoughts about sex and death, and they appeal to our shadow selves and allow us to explore taboo desires. Their sex appeal often makes us overlook their monstrousness. In vampire fiction like the Twilight saga and All Souls trilogy, and even the Vampire Diaries, vampires have not only become the romantic heroes, but their violence and unquenchable thirst for blood is often overlooked as a personality flaw, like alcoholism or gambling or snoring by their female partners. Violence is either ignored or excused until it escalates and becomes impossible for the female protagonist to break free of the vampire. So, in my close readings of these narratives, I've identified 4 stages of violence or tropes in romantic vampire fiction: stalking, seduction, dating, and marriage. Stage 1 is stalking. Merriam-Webster defines stalking as the act or crime of willfully and repeatedly following or harassing another person in circumstances that would cause a reasonable person to fear injury or death, especially because of express or implied threats. Like serial killers, vampires stalk their prey. Initially, stalking might seem harmless, creepy at best, but not necessarily dangerous. However, stalking usually leads to more violent behavior, and if your stalker is a serial killer or vampire, I would say that the threat of future bodily harm is guaranteed. Stalking has become a trope in romantic vampire fiction and is viewed as a sign that the vampire is interested in pursuing a relationship with the female protagonist. Vampires like Matthew Clairmont in the All Souls trilogy and Edward Cullen in the Twilight saga find it perfectly normal to climb through a woman's window and watch her sleep without her knowledge or consent. Not only is this behavior considered romantic, but it's also viewed as a tactic for keeping the protagonist safe while getting to know her. Stage 2 is seduction. So, after your vampire secret admirer makes his intentions known by either telling you he likes to watch you sleep, like Edward Cullen, or by appointing himself as your personal bodyguard, like Matthew Clairmont, the second stage is seduction. So, seduction, what is it? Again, I'm going to read a dictionary definition so that we're clear on its actual meaning. The act or pressure of giving in to a desire, especially when ill-advised. I think we can all agree that vampires are seductive. We know it's a bad idea to get involved with them, but their charm, good looks, and sex appeal make us overlook the danger. Damon Salvatore of the Vampire Diaries uses seduction almost as often as he uses violence to accomplish his goals. And Damon's primary goal is making Elena Gilbert fall in love with him. Damon inserts himself into Elena's life and pursues her until she finally acknowledges her attraction to him and agrees to a sexual relationship. Matthew Clairmont and Edward Cullen have a different approach to seduction. Matthew and Diana Bishop in the All Souls trilogy kiss and have oral sex, but no intercourse until their wedding night. Edward is extremely repressed and only agrees to have sex with Bella Swan on their honeymoon. So the question becomes, are they upholding tradition or are they using sex as a means of controlling their partners? So, once a vampire succeeds in seducing a female protagonist, stage 3 is dating. Dating in the 21st century has become a process by which people use social media to find out more about potential partners. Whether you use dating apps like Bumble, Hinge, Match.com, OkCupid, Grindr, etc., you're essentially being encouraged to stalk people online in the hopes that they would like to stalk you back. In fact, the dating app Happen, that's HAPPN, uses your GPS location to match you with potential partners who also use the app near you during your daily routine. So in a sense, dating itself has become vampiric. Not only is stalking the new normal, but single people have access to multiple partners at any given time. Just imagine how many blood types you'd be able to access. So, dating humans can also be dangerous, especially if your partner is abusive, whether it's physically, emotionally, or psychologically. But we often don't know how dangerous they are until we notice the red flags. We know that vampires are dangerous, so why on earth would anyone want to date one? Well, duh, they're hot. But it is important to remember that no matter how sexy they are, vampires are extremely dangerous, and anyone who chooses to date them is putting themselves at risk for violent and abusive behavior. Sure, the sex is great, but is the sex worth being gaslighted into thinking the person who is putting you in danger is the only person who can keep you safe? Can you say Stockholm Syndrome? Edward Cullen and Matthew Claremont are slightly less frightening than Franklin Mott from HBO's True Blood, but they're still terrible dating choices. So now that we've talked about Twilight and the All Souls trilogy, I'd like to focus a bit more on the Vampire Diaries and Stefan and Damon Salvatore. So Stefan seems like a nice guy. He's attractive, he's well groomed, and probably spends a fortune on hair products. He's friendly, a bit aloof, and seems uninterested in making friends with anyone at Mystic Falls High except for Elena Gilbert. We know that Stefan is a vampire, but Elena doesn't. In fact, Stefan has a lot of secrets. For instance, Stefan has a bit of a drinking problem. When he drinks human blood, he develops a bloodlust that turns him into what is known as a ripper, meaning he feeds on his victims so aggressively that he severs their heads. And he has a list of victims that would put most serial killers to shame. Stefan is deeply in denial about what he is, and the lies he tells himself end up making him the most dangerous person in Elena's life. Things get a little bit more complicated when Stefan's older brother, Damon, shows up. The most important bit of information you need to know about Stefan and Damon is that betrayal is a key theme of their backstory. Damon is, in my opinion, funnier, sexier, he dresses better, and isn't in complete denial about what he is. Eventually, Damon turns out to be more stable and reliable than Stefan, but he's still a vampire. So, while dating not one, but two vampires, Elena becomes a pro at making bad decisions. And because she willingly puts herself in danger again and again to be near these monsters, she becomes a monster herself. So, after you date and commit to your new life of loving a serial killer, that brings us to stage 4, marriage. Typically, there is no such thing as divorce for vampires. They take the whole idea of till death do us part very seriously. Matthew Claremont and Edward Cullen maintain very strict rules about sexual contact with their partners until they are wed. Some people would argue that they're upholding traditional values, but I'm more inclined to view this as their efforts to contain female sexuality and ensure that their partner remains faithful to them. So not only is premarital sex off the table for Diana Bishop and Bella Swan, but because their love interests continue to stalk and occupy all their time, there isn't space for meeting anyone else or engaging in casual sexual relationships with other partners. To a certain extent, vampires view their mates as property. A trope within romantic vampire fiction suggests that vampires are very territorial when it comes to their land, wealth, and property, and by extension, anyone they love or have a sexual relationship with. A vampire marriage must be witnessed by other vampires and usually involves an exchange of blood and some kind of oath. A couple must consummate their marriage before or after the ceremony for vampire society to accept the union. But under vampire law, until a human becomes a vampire, they are not considered a true spouse. Which brings me to the fact that if you're planning on marrying a vampire and want to have an eternity of happily ever after, the man you love will have to kill you. Now, most people try to avoid being murdered by their lover, but Bella Swan only agrees to get married if her fiancé agrees to kill her and make her a vampire before she turns 18. In Breaking Dawn, Bella shares her thoughts on what it means to love someone. You could run from someone you feared. You could try to fight someone you hated. All my reactions were geared toward those kinds of killers, the monsters, the enemies. When you loved the one who was killing you, it left you no options. How could you run? How could you fight? When doing so would hurt that beloved one. If your life was all you had to give your beloved, how could you not give it? If it was someone you truly loved. So, I don't know, does that sound like love to you? Because it shouldn't. I mean, giving your life to make a vampire or anyone else happy is suicide. It's assisted suicide, but still suicide. So just when you thought things couldn't get creepier, vampires can apparently impregnate human women in the Twilight Saga and certain kinds of witches in the All Souls trilogy. Becoming pregnant with a monster is a common trope in horror fiction, with the most famous example being Ira Levin's Rosemary's Baby. Not only do mothers of monsters experience traumatic and painful pregnancies that endanger their lives, but the mothers also tend to be insanely protective of the monstrous offspring. So whether you're pregnant with the Antichrist or a vampire hybrid, chances are that your fragile human body will be no match for your monster baby growing inside you. Bella Swan's pregnancy is an excellent example of body horror. In fact, as it turns out, Edward isn't really the one who kills Bella. Her child nearly kills her, and Edward ends up turning her into a vampire in order to save her. Are vampires still scary? Well, what's scarier than popular fiction that normalizes violence against women and teenage girls? Romanticized violence is problematic at best and potentially dangerous for teens and young women. I strongly recommend reading these novels as cautionary tales to help us identify abusive and narcissistic partners. While there are some obvious perks to marrying a vampire, like wealth, sex appeal, old world charm, rapacious sex drive, access to staggering amounts of white privilege, and the possibility of eternal youth, the cons often outweigh the pros. Vampires are undoubtedly sexy, fascinating creatures, but they should not be used as a benchmark for finding a mate. So, are vampires still scary? I'm curious to know what you think about that. If you're interested in reading my book that includes a vampire character who's a little shady, you can pick up Invisible Chains, either through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or my publishing house, Haverhill House Publishing. If you have questions, if you just want to talk about vampire fiction, you're welcome to contact me either by email or through Twitter. I'm on Facebook. And I also have a blog, Girl Meets Monster. And I would look forward to talking about this subject with all of you very, very much. Okay, So that was not the worst thing I did all week. Okay, so I'm curious to see if anyone has questions. Let's see here. Do you want to just ask questions in the chat if you have them, or if you have any thoughts? Yes, vampires are still very scary. Yeah, so like I said, I had a really hard time narrowing down the narratives that I was going to talk about, and I cut, I think, like 10 to 15 slides from this presentation. And like, what's my take on comedic vampires, like What We Do in the Shadows? Oh my God, I love them. One of the things that I really like about vampire comedy is, well, two things, or three things. First of all, it's about vampires, so I'm immediately going to be interested in it. If it's smart, it will, it'll look at the narratives, a lot of the narratives that I talked about. It'll look back to the traditions in fiction, but it's also usually very dark and kind of makes fun of a subject that is often uncomfortable and off-putting. And so I really, really like What We Do in the Shadows. I particularly like the film, but I've also enjoyed the TV show. I've had a lot of fun watching that. Let's see here. Lisa, I'm not sure what oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying that their motivations go beyond the drinking of blood, and you can't readily identify what those other motivations are. Yeah, that is terrifying. So I don't know if you're interested, but I wrote a 4-part blog series about this idea, and of violence against female protagonists in romantic vampire fiction. I wrote another piece about white privilege being the scariest vampire power in contemporary fiction. And I'm sure you're aware that just this past year, Stephanie Meyer released a new version of Twilight told from the POV of Edward Cullen. And I know a lot of people talk about the Twilight saga and they kind of poke fun at it. And but because it's so popular, I think it's more important to pay closer attention to it and the kind of story that it's telling, which as I mentioned, is kind of dangerous. But what's interesting to me is I read Midnight Sun when it came out, and what was very interesting to me about it was, because it's from Edward's point of view, it's really more of a horror novel, because he desperately wants to kill the people around him, and he is trying every second of every day not to do it. And his descriptions of what he wants to do to the students in the classroom, in the scene where she comes into the science classroom the first time, is one of the best pieces of horror fiction I've read in a long time in a vampire novel. So, don't completely dismiss the Twilight saga, and I highly recommend picking up Midnight Sun. I guess I don't really have a lot more to say, but I really hope that you'll contact me at some point and we can talk more about this. And I would love some feedback, just to know how you think this went, and also some recommendations for improving it, because I'd like to tweak this a bit and hopefully share it with other audiences. So yeah, I'm so glad you guys came, and thank you, Timmons, for being here. I hope I get to see you in person, and you too, Mike. And Lisa, I'm going to see you in October, I'm pretty sure. So I'm excited. Okay. Well, if you don't have any other questions, I think I'm going to wrap up. And I want to thank you again for joining me this evening and making this actually pretty enjoyable. So thank you. Bye, guys.